how would you define the Northern Crusades?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One of which is they were obviously a series of campaigns, military campaigns over several centuries that converted the Baltic from a frontier region beyond Christendom basically into a Christian lake. Um, it's important, I think, at the outset to note that these crusades evolved quite substantially over time. They went from being locally initiated, conducted with maybe partial blessings of the local church, to what one scholar has referred to as penitential wars, which were kind of crusades light, and we can come back to that in a bit, to by the early 13th century full-blown crusades with all the vows and indulgences and everything else. The other important point I think to bear in mind, and this maybe is true of all of the crusades, certainly the ones in Iberia, maybe less so, but I still think present in the Holy Land, they converged with an entirely mundane and secular impulse to colonize. So there's lots of fur, lots of land, lots of fish in the Baltic region, and there were lots of greedy nobles who wanted to get their hands on that. Now, I'm not saying that the Crusades in the North were not religious wars. They were. I'm not saying that they weren't holy wars. They were. But they intersected in quite specific ways with other things that were going on as part of this Germanic drive eastward and northward.
Right, and that's really interesting. Again, as you mentioned, Dr. Latham, the thing about the Northern Crusades is there was this element to it that was just the Saxon nobility and the Danes and these other groups that were interested in simply expanding territorially into the Baltic. So I guess what we could say is these campaigns probably would have happened regardless of whether or not they had been incorporated into this larger crusade movement. But, they kind of became a part of that. Or if they would have happened, they would have been different. But so let's kind of talk about that a little bit. I think that one of the things about the Northern Crusades that kind of gives them their unique reputation is that unlike the Crusades in Spain and in the Holy Land, which were about, one, recapturing territory that had previously been Christian or had a long tradition of being Christian, and two, about holding that land as opposed to converting the population. The Crusades in Spain and the Holy Land were never really about converting Muslims. In fact, that really never comes up, or it comes up very seldomly in the historiography. But the Northern Crusades really were, because you had this you kind of had this two-pronged interest that was intersecting at different times, and that is that the nobility was interested in expanding their territory, and the church was interested in expanding the church and bringing, these pagan Slavic peoples and Baltic peoples into the church.
It's one of those cases where chance and luck and coincidence really matters a very great deal. Think back to 1144, catastrophic from a Christian perspective, the fall of Edessa, right, as part of the broad Muslim counterattack in the Holy Land. And famously, there's a call for what becomes the Second Crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux, of course, is the chief apologist and ideologist for that Second Crusade. And the call goes out in Eastern Latin Christendom, and the local warrior class says, sorry, we're busy, we're fighting here. Again, in an entirely sort of mundane secular war of conquest against the Wendish peoples, a pagan Slavic people. And they said, could you please count this then as a crusade, and we can do our bit, but we'll do it here rather than in the Holy Land. And the Pope at the time agreed to this, but it was kind of crusading light. It was, as I said earlier, later came to be called penitential war. There weren't the same indulgences, there weren't the same vows, there wasn't the same sense of pilgrimage, there weren't the same protections afforded to those who were on crusade. They were all there, but in a slightly diminished and ad hoc way. And that's how we get the introduction of the institution of crusading from one end of Christendom really to the other end. And it's in a distorted, disfigured, partial form that suits the interests of the local nobility, suits the interest of the local church, and also converts, though, the Crusades from a very specific region or regions, because Iberia is in play at this point as well, to a kind of almost global war. being fought on many, many fronts, not just in the Holy Land, not just Iberia, but now in the north as well. So it comes to the region in a very, historically specific way. And then, as we'll talk about in a bit, it evolves and morphs over time, becoming more and more like the Crusades, becoming more and more controlled by the papacy, and becoming more and more fought by religious orders, the Teutonic Knights, and penitential warriors, as the Crusades have been fought elsewhere.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting Real Crusades history on Patreon. You'll find a link to our Patreon in the box below this video.